I was humiliated under the Eiffel Tower, my ex-husband Ryan laughing while the industry watched. That night, I swore it would be the last time he ever made me small. I rebuilt myself piece by piece, turning every wound into a weapon, until I came back to Paris standing beside Ethan Price, the one man Ryan could never touch. And when Ethan looked Ryan in the eye and called me his fiancée, Ryan's smirk vanished, and for the first time I saw fear. The sharp winter air bit at my cheeks as I stepped out of the car and looked up at the Eiffel Tower. Its steel frame sparkled under the Parisian night sky, an image I had once dreamed of sharing with someone who believed in me. Now I was here alone, carrying nothing but determination and a badge that bore my name, Claire Mitchell, Director of Marketing for Summit Realty International. This was supposed to be my chance to prove myself at one of the biggest real estate conferences in the world. I tightened my grip on my coat and walked toward the entrance of the networking event, my heels clicking against the stone. Inside, the air was warm and filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and a hum of different languages. I adjusted my blazer and scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces from the industry. Sophie Miller, my closest friend at Summit, waved me over with her usual bright smile. She handed me a glass of champagne and leaned closer so only I could hear. "You look like you belong here, Claire. Own it." I smiled faintly and nodded, but before I could respond, a voice sliced through the room like broken glass. I would know that voice anywhere. Ryan Carter, my ex-husband. I turned, and there he was standing near a group of executives by the window that overlooked the city. He looked almost exactly the same: tailored suit, perfectly combed hair, that smug confidence I once mistook for ambition. But this time his smirk was aimed at me. "Well, look who it is," Ryan said loudly enough for nearby conversations to pause. "Claire Mitchell, the queen of middle market condos. Did they run out of spots for the real players so they sent you instead?" Laughter rippled from a few of his colleagues. My face burned hot, but I refused to look away. Sophie stiffened beside me, her hand tightening around my arm, silently begging me not to react. I held my chin high. "Hello, Ryan." He stepped closer, his cologne sharp and familiar, an unwelcome ghost of my past. "Paris must feel like a different world for you, huh?" He gestured to the glittering view behind him. "This city isn't for people who play it safe. It's for people like me. Winners." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, but I stayed quiet. Every instinct screamed at me to shout back, to remind him that I had built my career from scratch while he used connections and office politics to climb. But I knew better than to give him that satisfaction. Ryan tilted his head, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You know, I almost admire your persistence. You keep showing up even though you'll never be more than average." Sophie finally snapped. "Ryan, that's enough. We're here for business, not your ego." He laughed, slow and condescending. "Oh, Sophie," still playing bodyguard. "Tell me, Claire, do you ever get tired of hiding behind people who actually matter?" I could feel every eye in that circle on me. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe. I would not give him what he wanted. Instead, I met his gaze and spoke evenly. "I'm not hiding behind anyone, Ryan, and I don't need to prove anything to you." He chuckled, as if I were a child speaking out of turn, then turned his back on me deliberately and clapped one of his colleagues on the shoulder. "Gentlemen, let's get back to discussing actual deals, shall we?" Sophie tugged my arm and guided me away, her voice low and sharp. "Ignore him. He wants you rattled, but you're not giving him that. Not tonight." We walked toward the far end of the terrace, where the city stretched beneath us like a sea of gold. I set my glass down on a nearby table and gripped the railing, the cool metal grounding me. My reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized, calm, poised, but with a fire burning in her eyes. Sophie stood beside me, her voice softer now. "He's not worth it, Claire." "He never was." I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cold Paris air. Maybe not, but he just reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Sophie looked at me, puzzled. Forgotten what? I turned to her, a faint, determined smile, tugging at the corner of my mouth. "That I am done letting him write the story." She didn't say anything, just nodded like she understood, And for the first time that evening, I felt the sting of humiliation turn into something sharper. Resolve. Far below, the lights of Paris flickered against the Seine, and in that moment, I silently promised myself one thing. This city would not be where I was humiliated. This city would be where I reclaimed everything he thought he had taken from me. I straightened my blazer and looked back toward the crowd, my pulse steadying. Ryan Carter might think he had the upper hand tonight, but he had just lit the fire that would burn him down, and I was ready to let it burn. When my flight touched down in New York, the city felt different. The skyline that usually gave me comfort now carried the weight of Ryan's words. I dragged my suitcase through the quiet terminal, my heels clicking against the polished floor, each step an echo of the humiliation I had swallowed in Paris. At home, the smell of coffee still lingered in my apartment, though I had been gone for days. I dropped my coat on the chair and stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. Ryan's voice played on a loop in my head, sharp and smug. Average, persistent, but forgettable. I gripped the windowsill until my knuckles turned white. The next morning, I visited my mother. Margaret Mitchell was waiting for me in her kitchen, stirring sugar into her coffee. She barely looked up when I walked in. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly, but without the softness I craved. I told her about Paris, about Ryan, and the way he humiliated me in front of everyone. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Claire, you need to accept what is. Real estate is a brutal business, and it has always been run by men. Be smart. Keep your head down." I stared at her, the words heavy in my chest. That is exactly what Ryan wants me to do. She sighed as if I were a stubborn child and placed her mug down. "You cannot keep fighting him. It will only hurt you." I didn't answer, because deep down I already knew I would fight him anyway. That night, I met Emily at a small diner near my apartment. She arrived with her hair pulled back, her scrub still on from her shift at the hospital. She slid into the booth and studied me with her sharp younger sister gaze. "You look like hell," she said between sips of coffee. "But I know that look." "What look?" I asked, leaning back in the booth. "The one that means you are about to make someone regret underestimating you. And I hope it is Ryan." Her words cracked something open in me. I laughed, and it felt good, raw, but real. "I am not going to let him win him, not this time." "Then make him watch you rise," she said. I nodded, and for the first time since Paris, I felt steady again. The next week, I signed up for an executive strategy course focused on international real estate. Every evening after work, I sat in a classroom full of sharp suits and sharper ambition. I listened, I wrote notes until my hand cramped, and I spoke up even when my voice trembled. The more I pushed, the stronger I felt. During one late-night class, as I presented a mock proposal for a luxury property project in Dubai, the instructor, a former senior VP in the industry, stopped me. "Claire, this is exceptional. You know that, right?" I smiled, small but sure. "I am starting to." In the following weeks, I threw myself into everything I had neglected. I booked a speech coach and practiced until I could stand in front of a room without my hands shaking. I attended every networking event Sophie dragged me to, shaking hands with investors, developers, and brokers who all seemed surprised by my determination. And every night when I was alone, I remembered Miami. It had been 2 years ago, back when Ryan and I were still married. I had been leading a mid-level project for Summit Realty in Miami, a development that could have launched me into the executive ranks. I worked day and night perfecting every detail. Then days before the pitch, Ryan convinced me to hand over key contacts to him, insisting he could help strengthen my case. Instead, he used them for himself. He pitched behind my back, secured the deal, and left me standing in a boardroom full of people who no longer trusted me. I had swallowed it back then, told myself it was marriage, that we were a team. But that betrayal had cost me a promotion. Now I could see it for what it was. He had never wanted a partner. He wanted someone small enough that his shadow always covered them. Not anymore. One evening, I returned home late from class and found Sophie waiting for me in my lobby, holding 2 coffees and a grin that was all teeth. "I got news," she said, handing me a cup. Ethan Price noticed your Dubai presentation. He specifically requested you for a European strategy project. My breath caught. Ethan Price, the CEO of Summit Realty's European division, was known in the industry for being impossibly brilliant and impossibly demanding. If he had noticed me, it meant one thing. I am in, I whispered almost to myself. Sophie smirked. Oh, you are more than in. Paris will see a very different Claire Mitchell next time. I tightened my grip on the coffee and looked past her at the city outside its towers glowing in the night. Ryan thought Paris was his territory. He thought he owned the story. But the next time I set foot in that city, I wouldn't just be another name on the conference list. I would make sure Ryan Carter knew exactly what it felt like to watch someone he underestimated rise so high that even he had to look up. The email came late on a Tuesday night while I was reviewing a market analysis at my kitchen table. My phone buzzed, and there it was. Subject line: Paris Strategic Development Initiative. I opened it, and for a moment, I just stared. I had been assigned to the La Défense redevelopment project, one of the biggest luxury real estate ventures in Europe. At the bottom of the email was a line that made my heart kick hard against my ribs. Project Oversight. Ethan Price, CEO of Horizon Global Europe. I leaned back in my chair and let out a shaky breath. This was it. The kind of project that could change everything. The kind of project that would put me in the same room with Ethan Price himself. And the kind of project Ryan Carter would see from Paris, whether he liked it or not. The next morning, Sophie practically tackled me when I walked into the office. She was holding a coffee in one hand and waving her phone in the other. Claire, I saw it. Paris. La Défense. This is huge. I smiled, trying to keep my voice steady. I know. It feels unreal. She grinned at me. It is very real. But brace yourself. Ryan is going to hate this. He already hates everything about me, I said, grabbing my files. This will just be dessert. Later that day, I joined the first virtual strategy meeting. Senior executives from New York, London, and Paris filled my screen. At the center of it was Ethan Price. He was calm, sharp, and commanding the kind of presence that didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He introduced the project and outlined Horizon Global's vision for transforming La Défense into a world-class luxury hub. Then it was my turn. When I presented my market analysis, I could feel every eye on me. I walked them through emerging investment trends, high net worth buyer behaviors, and a strategy for leveraging global branding that tied New York's prestige to Parisian exclusivity. As I spoke, Ethan didn't look away once. When I finished, there was silence. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. Excellent work, Claire. I want you to lead the branding task force on this. We need that level of precision. I felt my pulse jump, but I managed a steady thank you. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ryan's name in the participant list. He was logged in from Paris. I wondered if he heard every word. After the meeting, Sophie popped into my office with a sly smile. So good news and bad news. Which one first? Good news, I said, rubbing my temples. You impressed Ethan. She leaned against the door frame. He's not exactly generous with compliments, so you might want to frame that one. I almost laughed. And the bad news, Ryan has already started. He's been whispering to anyone who will listen that you are in over your head, that you don't have the experience for a project this size. I let out a sharp breath, but kept my voice cool. Let him talk. When this project is over, I will not need to defend myself. The results will. Sophie gave me a look that was half admiration and half concern. Just watch your back. He plays dirty, Claire. I know, I said quietly. Believe me, I know. The following weeks were a blur of late nights and endless calls. I lived and breathed La Défense. I dissected reports, coordinated with architects, and built a team that worked like a machine. Ethan scheduled a private review session with me to go over my branding proposal. He was as intimidating in person as his reputation suggested, but he listened. When I outlined a strategy connecting Horizon Global's Paris project to its flagship developments in New York, he leaned back in his chair and actually smiled. This is exactly the kind of forward thinking we need. Keep this up, Claire. I left that meeting walking taller than I had in months. It wasn't just approval, it was validation. One evening, Sophie and I grabbed dinner near the office. Over takeout cartons, she pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. Look at this. On the screen was a message from a contact in Paris. Ryan was already stirring up trouble, telling anyone in Horizon's European branch that I was only there because Ethan liked me. I rolled my eyes. Desperate men get loud, I said, sipping my drink. Sophie smirked, then let him scream himself hoarse. You just keep winning. I smiled faintly. I intend to. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window overlooking the city and opened my laptop. I didn't look at Ryan's name or his petty whispers. Instead, I looked at the Paris skyline on my screen. I imagined myself standing there again, but not as the woman he humiliated. No. This time I would walk into that city untouchable, and Ryan Carter would see every second of it. The next morning started with an email that nearly made me crush my coffee cup. It was forwarded by Sophie with no subject line, just 2 words in the body. Read this. I opened it, and there it was. Ryan's name in the header. His email was dripping with arrogance, sent to the executive board of Horizon Global and several senior managers in Paris. He claimed I lacked the experience to manage branding for a project as significant as La Défense, and that assigning me such responsibility was a risk the company could not afford. He even attached a list of fabricated examples where I supposedly mismanaged smaller projects. For a moment, I could hear my pulse in my ears. I wanted to storm into his office in Paris and tear him apart. But I knew better. I called Sophie. He actually wrote this, I said through gritted teeth. I told you he would. You need to be careful, Claire. Careful is not enough anymore, I replied. I am calling David. David Carter had been my attorney since my divorce. Calm, deliberate, and relentless in court, he was the kind of man who never wasted words. When I forwarded him the email, he called me within minutes. Claire, this is defamatory, he said. Start saving everything. Every email, every message, anything that even looks like an attempt to undermine you. If he keeps this up, we will have a case. I exhaled slowly, my anger sharpening into focus. Thank you, David. I am not letting him get away with this. I spent the next few days buried in work, not giving Ryan the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Late nights turned into early mornings as I polished every piece of my branding proposal until it gleamed. Then in the middle of it all, I got a call from Ethan Price's assistant. Mr. Price would like to schedule a review of your draft proposal before the next board meeting. When I joined the virtual call, Ethan was already there, his expression unreadable. He greeted me with a short nod. Claire, let's see what you have. I shared my screen and walked him through the full proposal. Every detail was airtight, from luxury buyer segmentation to a digital strategy tailored for international investors. I expected questions, interruptions, maybe even criticism. Instead, Ethan just watched, leaning back slightly, his hands clasped in front of him. When I finished, the silence was deafening. Finally, he spoke. Keep this version. Do not change a word. I blinked, unsure if I heard him right. That is it. That is it. His voice was even almost measured. I want the board to see this exactly as you presented it. When the board meeting came, I logged in with my notes open and my jaw set. Ryan was there, his camera on, wearing that smug expression I knew too well. I could almost hear him thinking he was about to watch me fall apart. The chairman opened the floor, and I began. I delivered my proposal the same way I had with Ethan, only sharper, more deliberate. I could feel the shift in the virtual room as I spoke. Executives leaned forward. Questions turned into nods of agreement. When I reached the final slide, Ethan's voice cut through. Excellent. This is the direction I want us to pursue. Ryan's smirk faltered. He tried to interject, his voice too loud. I think we need to consider if Claire has the bandwidth to manage. Ethan didn't raise his voice. Ryan, we are done questioning her bandwidth. Claire has my full confidence. Silence, the kind that told me no one dared argue with Ethan Price. Ryan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. After the meeting, Sophie called me, practically buzzing. Claire, did you see his face? I thought he was going to choke on his own ego. I laughed a sound that felt like release. He is not done. But neither am I. That night I saved Ryan's email into a secure folder exactly as David instructed. Then I opened my proposal again, but this time I didn't need to double-check it. I already knew it was bulletproof. Ryan had tried to humiliate me in front of the board, and instead he had handed me my first undeniable win. And it would not be my last. The smell of roasted chicken filled my mother's kitchen as I stepped inside. Margaret Mitchell stood at the counter wearing her usual apron, her hands busy arranging plates. Emily was already at the table scrolling through her phone, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. For a moment, it almost felt like any ordinary family dinner until my mother spoke. "So, Paris," she said without looking at me. "I hear Ryan is doing very well over there." I closed the door behind me and forced a smile. Ryan always knew how to take credit for other people's work. She turned, holding a serving dish, her expression sharp. "Maybe you should stop chasing these risky projects and find something steady here. Ryan has a position of power in Paris. You cannot expect to beat him by playing his game." I pulled out a chair and sat down, setting my bag on the floor. "I am not playing his game, Mom. I am building my own." Emily smirked without looking up from her phone. Translation: Claire is about to wipe the floor with him. My mother frowned and placed the dish on the table. "You girls always so dramatic. Claire, you are talented, but you should be realistic. You have a good job in New York. Why not focus on that instead of running yourself into the ground trying to prove a point?" I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "I am not just trying to win against Ryan. I want to become someone he can never humiliate again." Emily's phone clicked shut as she looked at me with a small, proud smile. "Now that is the Claire I know." Margaret shook her head, muttering under her breath as she set the silverware down. "You sound like you are fighting a war." "Maybe I am," I replied, my tone calm but unshaken. Dinner was quiet for a few minutes, broken only by the sound of forks against plates. My mother eyed me with that mix of worry and disapproval she had perfected over the years. Finally she sighed. "I just do not want to see you burned out or disappointed again." I swallowed a bite and met her gaze. "I have been disappointed before. This time I am not stopping until I win." Emily nudged me under the table and grinned. "If you need me to print Ryan's face on a dartboard for motivation, I can make it happen." I laughed, shaking my head, and for a second even my mother's mouth twitched as if she were fighting a smile. After dinner I stayed to help clear the table. Emily followed me into the kitchen while Mom busied herself in the living room. She leaned against the counter and whispered, "She does not get it, but I do. You are doing the right thing, Claire." I rinsed a plate and placed it in the dishwasher. "Thanks, Em. I just need to make sure I am ready for whatever comes next." "You already are," she said, her voice certain in a way that made me believe it too. When I finally left my mother's house, the night air in Queens was cool and sharp. I stood by my car for a moment, staring at the skyline in the distance. My mother's doubts lingered in my mind, but Emily's words echoed louder. Back at my apartment, I opened my laptop and reviewed the latest updates from Paris. Every number, every forecast, every report reminded me that I was getting closer. Ryan had thrown everything at me, and I was still standing. Stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. He thought I was the same woman he once walked away from. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The call came just after 7 in the morning. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter as I poured my first cup of coffee. Sophie's name lit up the screen, and the urgency in her voice told me this was not a casual chat. "Claire, get online. Now. Emergency meeting. Paris deal is falling apart." I set my mug down, grabbed my laptop, and opened the Horizon Global Conference link. Faces filled the screen, tense and grim. At the center was Ethan Price, his expression sharp, but composed. This was the kind of crisis that could sink a $200 million deal. The client, a major European investor, was leaning toward a competitor who had swooped in with aggressive terms overnight. Ryan was on the call too, sitting smugly in the Paris office, probably savoring every second. Ethan's voice cut through the noise. "We need a viable strategy to keep them. Now." Everyone spoke at once, tossing out safe, predictable solutions, none of which would move the needle. I sat back, listening, my mind racing. Then I saw it. A gap in the competitor's offer, a weakness that nobody else had mentioned. I unmuted. We are looking at this wrong. They are undercutting us on price, but they are not addressing long-term asset value. If we emphasize our track record with premium developments and add a performance-based incentive package, we can beat them without slashing our margins. The room went quiet. Ryan laughed under his breath. That sounds desperate. I ignored him. I pulled up data I had already prepared for another presentation and shared my screen. I walked them through the numbers, each figure backing my point. I could feel Ethan watching me closely, his expression unreadable. When I finished, I looked directly into the camera. If we show them this, if we make them understand that Horizon is not just selling a deal but a future, they will stay. For a moment, there was silence. Then Ethan spoke. Prepare the presentation. You will deliver it to the client with me. Ryan's smirk vanished. Wait. Ethan didn't even look at him. Claire has the lead on this. My chest tightened, but not from fear. This was my chance. The next 24 hours were a blur. Sophie and I stayed late in the office reviewing every detail. I refined the slides until they were flawless. David even called to check in on me when he heard about Ryan's interference. Claire, he said, keep the receipts. I already had a folder full of Ryan's attempts to sabotage me, but I pushed the thought aside. That battle could wait. When the client presentation began the following day, Ethan introduced me. His voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone else listen. Claire Mitchell will walk you through our proposal. I steadied my breathing and began. I talked about market positioning, future asset value, and Horizon Global's unmatched portfolio. I showed them projections, success stories, and concrete proof that no competitor could match us in long-term value creation. By the time I finished, the investor who had been leaning toward our competitor leaned back in his chair and smiled. This is persuasive. We will proceed with Horizon. Relief swept over me, but it was nothing compared to the look Ethan gave me as the call ended. It wasn't just approval, it was respect. Later in a private debrief, Ethan addressed the team. This project was almost lost, but Claire's strategy turned it around. I want her leading more of our European negotiations moving forward. Ryan didn't speak. He sat frozen, jaw tight, while Sophie sent me a text under the table that simply said, legendary. After the meeting, I gathered my things, still riding the high of the win, when my phone rang. It was Ethan. His voice was calm, but there was something new in it. Claire, excellent work today. That was exactly the level of thinking I expect from top leadership. Keep it up. Thank you. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. When the call ended, I stared at my screen for a long moment. Ethan Price didn't hand out compliments easily, and now I had earned one in front of the entire executive team. Ryan had tried to make me look small. Instead, he had just handed me the spotlight, and I had no intention of giving it back. The following week, I tore apart my entire routine. If Paris was going to be the stage where I faced Ryan again, I would walk in sharper, stronger, and completely untouchable. I started each morning before sunrise, running along the East River to clear my head, before diving into a schedule packed with strategy sessions and presentation drills. Sophie was relentless. She booked a private speech coach to polish my delivery until every word landed with precision. She made me rehearse in empty conference rooms until I could handle any question without hesitation. When I slipped or stumbled, she only smirked and said, "Again." And I did. After work, I met with a negotiation consultant, a former luxury real estate executive who specialized in high-stakes deals. He pushed me to think faster, anticipate counterarguments, and never leave room for doubt. The first session left me exhausted, but by the third, I was walking out of those meetings with the kind of confidence I hadn't felt in years. In the middle of this whirlwind, Ethan reached out directly. "Claire, I want you to join the core strategy team for Paris," he said during a brief video call. His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight of his words. You will be working closely with me and the executive committee. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Thank you, Ethan. I will not let you down. I know you will not, he replied, his gaze steady, before he ended the call. Sophie nearly knocked over her coffee when I told her. Do you realize what this means? You are not just going back to Paris, Claire. You are going back with a seat at the table. I smiled, a slow, steady smile that felt earned. This time Ryan would not see me coming until it was far too late. Word traveled fast. Within days, Ryan found out I was returning for the second international conference. Sophie's contact in Paris sent me a screenshot of a group chat between several Horizon employees overseas. Ryan had laughed, apparently saying, "Let her come. She cannot beat me here." I stared at that line for a long time before closing the screen. Let him laugh. He had no idea what was waiting for him. As the date approached, I immersed myself in every detail of the La Défense project. I studied the Paris market like I had lived there for years. I memorized data, tracked competing developments, and crafted counter-strategies to shut down any objection before it could even form. At night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by open binders and glowing screens. Emily stopped by once with takeout and stared at me like I had lost my mind. "You are turning your living room into a war room," she said, dropping the bag of food on my table. I grinned and bit into a fry. "Wars are won with preparation." She raised a brow. "Just make sure you remember to eat while you are conquering Paris." The night before my flight, Sophie came over to help me pack. She leaned against my desk, arms crossed, as I folded one of my tailored named blazers. "Remember the first time you went to Paris?" "How could I forget?" I said, dryly. She smirked. "Good, because I want you to remember how much has changed since then. You are not walking in alone this time. You have Ethan's backing the core team, and most importantly, you have proof you can win." I zipped up my suitcase and looked at her. "This is not just about winning anymore." Her smirk softened into a knowing smile. "No, this is about ending him." The next morning I boarded the flight to Paris, with my shoulders squared and my heart steady. As the plane lifted off the runway, I stared out at the city shrinking below me, my reflection faint against the glass. This time, I was not coming to Paris to defend myself. I was coming to claim the ground Ryan thought belonged to him, and I would make sure he never forgot it. The car pulled up to the entrance of Le Maurice, and the moment the doors opened, Paris greeted me with its crisp air and endless hum of energy. I stepped out, heels striking the pavement, with a confidence I had earned, not borrowed. Inside the grand lobby, crystal chandeliers glimmered above marble floors. I barely had time to take it in before I saw him. Ethan Price was waiting. He stood near the reception desk, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight and assured. When his eyes met mine, he gave a small nod, one that felt like more than formality. "Welcome back, Claire," he said, his voice steady but warm enough to draw a quiet strength out of me. "Paris has been waiting." "Thank you, Ethan. I intend to make this trip count." I caught the faintest curve of approval at the corner of his mouth before he gestured toward the concierge desk. "Your suite is ready. I want you rested before the welcome event tonight." Rest was not something I planned to do. Tonight would be my first chance to face Ryan on my terms. Hours later, I arrived at the welcome reception. The ballroom was buzzing with conversation executives from Horizon Global, mingling with European investors, glasses of champagne in their hands. I felt eyes on me as I crossed the room, not from scrutiny but from curiosity. I was no longer the woman who had been humiliated under the Eiffel Tower. I was the woman who had saved a $200 million deal, the one Ethan Price had personally chosen for his core team. And then I saw him. Ryan Carter was leaning casually against the bar, his smirk already in place, surrounded by two colleagues who seemed eager to feed his ego. When his gaze landed on me, his smirk sharpened into something colder. He straightened, lifted his glass in mock salute, and stepped closer. "Claire," he said loud enough for several nearby conversations to pause. "I see you are still riding that streak of luck." I tilted my head, letting a calm smile play on my lips. "Good to see you too, Ryan." His eyes flickered in irritation at my composure. You know, it is impressive, really. Surviving this long in a league you do not belong in. Sophie, who had appeared at my side without a word, leaned in slightly. Careful, Ryan, she said lightly. Some of us actually work for a living. He laughed, but it lacked conviction. Same old Claire hiding behind the loyal friend. I did not take the bait. I met his gaze and held it until the silence felt heavier than his words. Then I smiled, slow and deliberate. I guess we will see who is hiding Ryan. Before he could reply, I felt a presence behind me. Ethan had stepped into the circle, his hands casually in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something sharper than disapproval. Is there a problem here? Ethan asked, his tone even, but every syllable carried weight. Ryan stiffened and forced a laugh. Of course not, Ethan. Just catching up with an old acquaintance. Ethan's gaze lingered on him a beat longer than necessary before shifting to me. Claire, the investors from Zurich are asking for you. I told them you are the best person to explain the branding strategy. The words landed like a quiet victory. I gave Ryan one last glance, a polite but razor-edged smile, and turned to Ethan. Of course. As Ethan led me away, I felt Ryan's stare burning into my back. He was unsettled, and for the first time in years, I liked that feeling. Later that evening, after I had finished briefing the Zurich investors, I stepped onto the terrace for some air. Paris stretched out beneath the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Ethan joined me a moment later, standing beside me in silence. You handled that well, he said eventually. I glanced at him. Thank you. His gaze was steady, calculating, but approving. Ryan likes to underestimate people. It is one of his greatest weaknesses. I smiled faintly, turning back to the view. Then he is going to regret underestimating me. Ethan's expression didn't change, but I caught the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes before he excused himself to rejoin the executives inside. I stayed on the terrace a moment longer, the cool Paris air brushing against my face. Ryan had tried to knock me off balance, but instead he had reminded me exactly why I was here. This was no longer his city. It was mine now. The morning of the conference, I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room at Le Maurice, adjusting the lapel of my blazer until it sat perfectly. My presentation files were already stored and backed up twice. I had rehearsed every slide, every answer, every counterpoint. Today was not about survival. It was about domination. When I arrived at the convention center, the energy was electric. Executives, investors, and developers from all over the world filled the grand hall. Conversations in English, French, and German blended together under the glow of chandeliers. I spotted Ryan near the front, shaking hands, flashing that same smug grin. He looked like a man who thought he was untouchable. I walked past him without a glance. Sophie whispered from behind me. He looks nervous. He should be, I replied, steadying my breath as I approached the stage. When it was my turn, Ethan introduced me to the audience. His voice was calm but commanding. Claire Mitchell, Director of Marketing for Horizon Global, will present our branding and market strategy for the La Défense project. I could feel the weight in his words, the way he framed me not as support, but as the centerpiece. I stepped up, clicked to my first slide, and spoke. I started with data, hard numbers, market trends, luxury demand curves that painted a clear picture of what the next 5 years in Paris would look like. Then I shifted to strategy, connecting Horizon Global's global reputation to this single project in a way no competitor could match. My voice didn't shake. My pacing was deliberate. The room leaned in closer with every word. Ryan's face was visible from where I stood. He was trying to hide it, but his jaw was tight. Midway through, he raised his hand. If I may, he said loudly, his tone smooth, but forced. While Claire's presentation is interesting, there are some serious questions about the feasibility of such an aggressive strategy in this market. I kept my expression neutral. Ethan turned his head slowly toward Ryan. Ryan let her finish. Ryan gave a stiff laugh. I am only suggesting... Sit down, Ryan. Ethan's voice was calm, but it cut through the room like glass. He didn't raise it, but he didn't need to. Every executive in the hall went silent. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. He lowered himself back into his chair, his face flushed. I turned back to my slides and continued without missing a beat. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sharp, not the polite kind, but the kind that carried weight. Ethan stood and looked directly at the board. Horizon Global is fortunate to have Claire leading this strategy. She is the reason we will set a new standard in Paris. I felt the words settle in the room, undeniable and final. Ryan sat frozen in his chair, staring straight ahead, and for once he had nothing to say. After the session, I stepped out into the lobby to grab a glass of water. Sophie was there before I even saw her. "Claire," she whispered, grinning so wide it almost looked painful. "Did you see his face?" I smiled faintly. I did not need to look at him. I could hear it in the silence. A few minutes later, Ethan approached. His presence quieted the small crowd around us. "Well done, Claire," he said, his tone measured, but clear enough for anyone nearby to hear. "This is why I wanted you here." "Thank you, Ethan." He gave me a short nod before moving on to speak with the investors. I watched him walk away, a strange mix of relief and adrenaline settling over me. Ryan brushed past me on his way out. His jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That silence was louder than any insult he had ever thrown at me. I stepped to the side of the hall, letting the hum of conversation surround me. For the first time since I set foot in Paris, I wasn't just holding my ground. I was owning it. And Ryan Carter knew it. The city glittered beneath the Eiffel Tower as the elevator carried us to the observation deck, where Ethan's private networking event was being held. The doors opened to soft music, warm lighting, and the quiet hum of conversations between some of the most powerful figures in real estate. The air was cool and sharp, carrying that unmistakable Parisian night energy. I stepped out, my heels clicking against the floor, my head held high. Ethan was already there, speaking with two investors near the panoramic windows. When he saw me, he excused himself and walked over. "Claire, you look ready for tonight." His words were simple, but his tone was approving in a way that made the tension in my chest ease. I smiled. "After today, I feel ready for anything." He gave me one of those brief nods of his, then gestured toward a group gathered near the bar. "Investors from Milan. They specifically asked to meet you." I was halfway to joining them when I felt it. That presence, that familiar chill. Ryan Carter. He stood across the room, a drink in hand, his smirk already sharp as a blade. His eyes locked on mine, and for a brief moment it was as if the noise of the event faded away. He was going to try something. I could see it in the way he straightened his jacket and started toward me. "Claire," he drawled, as if we were old friends. "Paris suits you. Though let's be honest, no matter how far you climb, you will always be what you were." I met his gaze and didn't blink. "And what was that, Ryan?" He leaned in just enough for the words to sting. "My employee." A few people nearby turned, catching his tone. That was exactly what he wanted. He wanted witnesses. I didn't flinch. I didn't even speak. I simply smiled, slow and steady, the kind of smile that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Ryan's smirk faltered for half a second, and that was when I saw movement behind me. Ethan stepped forward. His presence was calm but commanding, and the shift in the room was immediate. He placed a hand on my arm, steady and unhurried, then looked directly at Ryan. "Is there a reason you are standing here insulting one of my executives?" "Ryan!" Ryan laughed, but it rang hollow. "Just making conversation." Ethan's eyes stayed on him, sharp as steel. "Then let me make something clear." He moved closer, his voice steady, but carrying enough force to quiet everyone around us. "Claire is not just the brightest star in Horizon Global. She is my fiancée." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room stilled. A murmur ran through the crowd, the kind that spreads fast in a room full of powerful people who thrive on information. Ryan's face drained of color, then flushed a deep red. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on mine as if anchoring the moment. You will treat her with the respect she has earned, or you will find yourself answering to me. Ryan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Ethan, then at me, then at the people who were now watching him with thinly veiled curiosity and judgment. Finally, he stepped back. His drink trembled slightly in his hand. "Congratulations," he muttered, though his voice cracked halfway through. Ethan didn't even acknowledge it. He simply turned to me with that same calm authority. "Shall we?" I nodded, letting him guide me away from Ryan, who stood frozen where we had left him. Sophie caught my eye from across the room and mouthed one word: legendary. As Ethan and I joined the investors, I felt it deep in my chest, steady and unshakable. Ryan Carter had spent years trying to make me small. Tonight, in front of the world he thought he owned, I had watched him crumble without lifting a finger. And for the first time I realized I didn't just win, I had ended the game entirely. The next morning I walked into Horizon Global's Paris headquarters with a calm I had never felt before. The glass walls of the executive floor reflected the sharp winter sunlight, and everything about the day felt clean and precise, as if the city itself was ready for what was coming. Ethan was already in the boardroom when I arrived. He stood at the head of the table, composed as always, reviewing a folder in front of him. When he looked up, there was no small talk, only a brief nod that carried the weight of quiet certainty. "It is time." The board filed in shortly after their conversations hushed the anticipation thick in the air. Then Ryan entered. He was dressed perfectly as usual, but there was something brittle in the way he carried himself. When his eyes met mine, there was no smirk, no swagger, only a flicker of unease that he tried and failed to hide. Ethan didn't waste a second. He opened the folder and placed a stack of printed emails on the table. His voice was calm but sharp enough to cut through the room. "These are documented communications from Ryan Carter. He sent them to senior management, spreading false information about Claire Mitchell's competency and deliberately attempting to undermine an executive-level project." Ryan stiffened in his chair. Those were internal concerns, he started, but Ethan didn't give him room to finish. "Concerns are brought to me directly," Ethan said evenly. "They are not weaponized against my team." The board members exchanged glances. A few of them began whispering, but Ethan raised his hand and silence fell again. He clicked a remote, and the emails appeared on the screen behind him. Every word was there in black and white. Lies about me. Claims that I was incapable. Ryan's name on every single one. I watched his jaw tighten, his fingers drumming against the table. For the first time, he looked cornered. One of the board members cleared his throat. "This is clear misconduct." Ryan turned defensive, his voice sharp and desperate. "I was only protecting the company." Ethan didn't flinch. "By sabotaging the very project you were assigned to support? By attacking an executive who just secured a $200 million deal?" Ryan froze. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Ethan closed the folder and straightened. "Effective immediately, Ryan Carter is suspended. The formal termination process will begin today." The words landed like a hammer. The room was silent except for the faint shuffle of papers as the board members nodded in agreement. Ryan sat there pale and rigid, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched as the man who had once taken so much from me unraveled in front of the same people he had always wanted to impress. Finally, Ethan turned to me. "Claire, your team will assume direct oversight of Ryan's accounts until further notice." "Understood," I said, my voice even steady and louder than Ryan's silence would ever be. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Ryan left quickly, his shoulders rigid, his face unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way the room seemed lighter the moment he was gone. Back in my office, Sophie called from New York before I could even sit down. Her face appeared on my screen, and she was practically glowing. "Claire, you did it." "I didn't do anything," I said softly, a small smile tugging at my lips. "He did this to himself." She grinned wider. "Maybe. But you were the one who stood your ground until he crumbled." I leaned back in my chair, letting the truth of her words settle. For years, Ryan had been the shadow looming over every step I took. Now that shadow was gone. And for the first time, I could see the path ahead of me, clear and wide open. That night I stood on the Alexander III Bridge with Ethan by my side. Paris shimmered around us, the lights of the city, reflecting off the Seine like scattered diamonds. The cold air brushed my skin, but I felt nothing but warmth, the kind that came from the quiet weight of everything I had fought through, and finally left behind. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the railing and glanced at me. "You know, Claire, you didn't just beat him, you rewrote your whole story." I let out a soft laugh, the kind I hadn't felt in years. Maybe I did. He turned toward me, his expression calm but steady, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something more than the composed CEO. I saw someone who respected me not just for what I had accomplished, but for who I had become. "You are not the same woman who walked into that first meeting," he said. I smiled at him, the city lights flickering in my peripheral vision. "No, I am not." We stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the river below and the hum of Paris wrapping around us. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small velvet box. "A gift," he said simply, "for closing the chapter." Inside was a pair of delicate diamond earrings. They were simple, elegant, and somehow felt like proof that I had survived every battle and come out whole. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice steadier than I expected. Later, as I walked back to my suite, I looked at the earrings one last time before placing them on the nightstand. I didn't need them to remind me of what I had done, but I liked the thought of carrying something beautiful out of Paris. When I returned to New York, my phone rang before I had even unpacked. It was my mother. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it I had waited years to hear. "Claire, I was wrong. You proved me wrong, and you proved everyone else wrong too." I closed my eyes for a second, holding the words like they were fragile and precious. "Thanks, Mom." And then Emily burst through my apartment door with a bag of groceries and a grin that could have lit the whole city. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered against my shoulder, "I told you. I knew you would win." I hugged her back, laughter bubbling out of me in a way that felt like release. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about finally being free. That night, I stood by the window of my apartment, the skyline glowing against the dark sky, and I put on the earrings I had bought in Paris. They weren't just jewelry. They were proof. Proof that I had faced the man who tried to break me, stood my ground, and walked away not just unscathed, but stronger than I had ever been. If you have ever been underestimated, remember this. The sweetest revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's the quiet moment when you no longer have to explain yourself to anyone. Success speaks for itself, and when it does, it is louder than anything your enemies will ever say.